Recording now. Okay. And I'd like to formally welcome you all to another installment of the Cities and Environment Research Network discussion series. So thank you for taking the time to join us tonight. We're happy to have you with us. My name is Nina Araneta Alana. I'm a PhD student at the Melbourne Law School. And I am in Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nations here in Melbourne, Australia. And I'd like to pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So I'll be the facilitator for tonight's discussion. Before we begin, I will give a brief introduction about our group and set out the house rules for our discussion. So our group is the Cities and Environment Research Network. It's a gathering of postgraduate scholars, PhD candidates, postdocs, and lecturers who are primarily based in Australian universities with research in the juncture of urbanization, the built environment, climate change and disaster, public art, learning environments, informality, and allied fields as they relate to the Philippines and the Filipino context. So we started this formal discussion series last year at the start of the pandemic to discuss the various public issues brought about by the pandemic. So we've since maintained this as a forum to bring together Filipino scholars, academics, and practitioners to share ongoing interdisciplinary research and work. Okay, so now for housekeeping matters. For tonight's discussion, we'd like to request everyone to keep their audio muted in order to preserve bandwidth and to ensure that the presentation is given without distraction. You may use the chat feature to type in your comments or if you have to communicate something to me. So during the Q&A, please use the raise hand function. It's at the bottom of your screen and I will acknowledge you. You may turn on your video and audio to pose your question, but if you're experiencing any technical problems, you may use the chat function instead. So as I mentioned earlier, this webinar is going to be recorded, and I think Reden is one of the members of our group, has shared the link to our YouTube channel. Okay. Allow me now to introduce Jelly Molino, our resource speaker for tonight. Okay. So Jelly is an international legal expert on sustainable public procurement who has experience working with international organizations such as the UNEP, the OECD, the ITC, ILO, and the Asian Development Bank in the areas of public procurement and sustainability. So she's actually my colleague from the ADB before, although we never got to work together. She has been a member of the Philippine Bar since 2007 and has been active in litigation on environmental and administrative cases, including corporate compliance. She's currently finishing her PhD research on the role of multilateral development banks in promoting sustainable public procurement for innovation towards smart cities at the University of Turin in Italy. She holds an LLM in government procurement and environmental law from the George Washington University Law School, an EMBA from the AIM, or Asian Institute of Management, a JD from the University of Batangas, and a BA degree in philosophy from UP Diliman. Her research interests focus on the improvement of regulations and practices on government procurement, sustainability, and anti-corruption mechanisms in developing countries. Okay, Jelly.
Good morning and good evening to everyone. Let me share my screen. Is it sharing now? Is it okay? So I will be discussing and sharing about my research on sustainable public procurement. And I actually titled it as an emerging research and a policy agenda. So one of the questions that you might actually ask is, why is it an emerging agenda? Why is it not a research and a policy agenda? So all of you most probably have heard of public procurement. Public procurement is when the government actually buys its need, government by their needs for services, goods, and even the construction of infrastructure projects. And we all know that governments have been buying since time immemorial. But at any rate, the issue on sustainability is actually an emerging issue in terms of government contracting. Actually, it was first introduced sometime in the late 1990s. So basically, it's just an emerging. Actually, when I was taking my LLM at the GW school, where I focused on sustainable public procurement, I could hardly find materials on the topic. So, but right now, interestingly, while we're doing our work for UNEP on the 2021 Sustainable Public Procurement Global Review, we have actually a very good list of bibliographic index that we will be launching and releasing this fall. So it is an emerging research and a policy agenda, and I will be, of course, arguing on that in my presentation. In doing so, I don't see my slides. I don't know what is happening. So, okay, is it moving?
Yes, we can see the slide entitled Outline.
Oh, okay. So it's okay if I just do it from here. So at any rate, I am dividing my presentation into 4 topics. The first is, of course, on the issue on sustainability. So as mentioned, it is actually a new topic in terms of government contracting. By new, I mean it's only late 90s. Because there is supposed to be a potential conflict between sustainability and the other public procurement principles. So the question is there really a conflict? So I want to show to you some of the discussions on the particular issue. And then, of course, let me also present a brief literature review on what is happening about sustainable public procurement as a topic for research. And thereafter, I will try to raise the question on whether or not sustainable public procurement may be considered as a standalone policy or just an instrument to support other policies. And then I will conclude on the trends. What do we expect on the call for more sustainability in public procurement or government contracting? So for those who are not in public governance, if you have questions, because I'm assuming this presentation will my audience are familiar with public procurement, but at any rate, I will try to be very brief in my discussion. So if you have questions, we'll have more time, because I prefer more on discussion rather than providing a presentation. So the first paper that is actually considered by procurement specialists as a research work worth citing on what are the principles of public procurement is the one published in 2002 by Professor Stephen Schooner of the GW Law School. So it's one of the most cited articles that actually highlighted and listed the primary procurement principles, although he was very clear that these are not very exhaustive. There are other principles, but at any rate, in his assessment of all the procurement regimes all over the world, these are the most common principles, though at any rate, his discussion was very focused on how these principles applied in public procurement in the US perspective. So if you will look, there are actually 9 principles that were mentioned, but he was very, very clear that the first 3 principles were considered as the overarching principles: competition, integrity, and transparency. Why? Because, of course, he was discussing it from the US perspective, and he was really very clear that insofar as the US public procurement of government contracting is concerned, they are actually, they believe in the power of the market. So meaning that for the government to be able to get the so-called best value or have the best possible services by acquiring best value in terms of service, getting the best contractor, you really have to open the competition and make sure that the private suppliers will actually compete to provide the best possible services to the government. So that is why he was very clear that if you really want to have the best suppliers and contractors, you have to make sure that you are opening the competition to the market. And then, of course, we all know that when we speak of public procurement, we are using public funds. That is why, corollary with competition, he was very clear that there should be integrity. And by integrity as a principle, he actually argued on the importance of drafting the rules to make sure that who are accountable for what. Because we all know that when we speak of public procurement, one of the issues actually is bribery or corruption. I mean, Transparency Index had always or is always releasing reports in terms of corruption in government contracting. And the last report that I read showed that about 30% of the funds for government contracting or public procurement are actually going to corruption. So that's why it's also very important that integrity is a primordial principle in government contracting. And of course, for us to be able to make sure that there is competition and there will be more integrity, there has to be transparency. And transparency is actually promoting impartiality and openness of the procedure. So it's more on systemic approach. And then the other principles that Professor Schooner highlighted are considered actually as aspirations. He actually argued that some of these principles might be conflicting with the other principles. That's why you really have to make sure that when you actually open your bid, for example, or tender, you have to assess all of these aspirations. Say, for example, on an issue of wealth distribution or socioeconomic, what is the principle for? It is actually applied when you are giving preference to domestic or local suppliers. So you have to make sure that the wealth of government is distributed to those who have less. But at any rate, if you are going to have domestic preference or what we sometimes called as set aside for small medium enterprises, that may be in conflict with other procurement principles such as competition, because you're limiting the competition. So you see, there are so many principles in terms of public procurement, but the primordial are the first three. And when we speak of uniformity, it only means that the rules should apply to all government agencies. So it will be very difficult for example, a supplier has to learn different rules when dealing with different government institutions. That's why even in the international arena, there is actually an attempt to provide a uniform procedures. We have a model public procurement a model issued by UNCETRAL. So on the assumption that there is a possibility to provide for uniform guidelines in terms of government contracting or public procurement. And then efficiency is also a principle. Efficiency requires that when we actually do our contracting, we are using less resources. Otherwise, imagine if the cost of the procurement process will be more than the value of the product to be procured. So that is not an efficient way. Or the other issue on efficiency is like what happened during the pandemic. So we need supplies, specifically those that are addressing the pandemic requirements. But the problem is, if you look at the procurement regulations, you need to follow certain procedures. You need to publish, and there are processes. But at any rate, for efficiency, you will notice that even in the Philippines, that's the first thing that I did look at, is to check on the Bayanihan law. And there is actually a provision in all of those laws which actually called for the suspension of the application of our procurement regulation if the goods to be procured or services to be procured are directly related to addressing the pandemic effects. So at that particular case, so you have to make sure that when you speak of government contracting, it has to be efficient. You have to make sure that the needs are addressed at the time it is needed by the customer, which is actually the last thing. Customer satisfaction. Actually, there's an issue insofar as customer satisfaction in public procurement. Who is the customer? Is it the end user or is it us, the public, who is actually paying taxes, and these taxes are, of course, form part of the funds which is appropriated for a project. And then if this project will be implemented, then you have to procure the goods, the services, and the infrastructure for the delivery of the project. So who is the customer? Is it the end user, like who will be accepting, for example, the laptop that will be procured in order, for example, to make sure that there will be more online transactions? Or should it be the clients of that particular public official who will be using the laptop? So those are some of the principles that are very important to consider insofar as public procurement is concerned. So that is why there is really an issue specifically on the issue on wealth distribution and socioeconomic, because that is actually introducing the concept of sustainability, specifically on social considerations. And then the second well-cited author insofar as public procurement is concerned is, of course, Professor Sue Smith of the University of Nottingham. So if you will look at the first, the slide that I used, this is actually using US perspective. And this one is using the EU perspective insofar as public procurement is concerned. Although they are actually the same, but here, Professor Sue Smith was very, very clear that these are all objectives, and the first three objectives are considered as key procurement principles, not because they are actually the topmost principles, but only because these principles are oftenly resulting to conflict with other principles, specifically the issue on competition and equal treatment. Why? Because, you know, a competition means you have to open the procurement to everyone, to the market. But at any rate, you have, for example, the issue on environmental policies, the issue on social policies. Say, for example, you are going to implement green public procurement where you are providing certain criteria that require the supplier to have a particular label or its equivalent, although it is not actually allowed to specify a particular brand. You can mention the label, but make sure that equivalents are accepted. So if you are actually providing that in your technical specifications in public procurement, you are actually lessening the competition. So there is always this issue that when that sustainability actually hinders competition. Why? Because the market is not yet very green, specifically if you are pursuing green public procurement. So, and then of course, equal treatment is also an issue, because if you are giving preference, for example, to small, medium enterprises, or you are giving preference to local and national suppliers, then that will be a trade issue, specifically if your country is a signatory of the WTO Government Procurement Agreement. The Philippines is not yet a party, but it actually applied as an observer. So if you will look at all of these principles, and then we go back on the issue on whether or not sustainability is actually conflicting with these other principles. Of course, there is like, or there are two ways to look at it. Some would say, yes, it is conflicting, but of course, on our end, who are advocating more sustainability in government procurement or contracting, are actually saying that they are not. So how do we go on that particular direction? So there are actually series of numerous articles that are telling that there is actually a conflict. Say, for example, this is a very good case that was decided by the Court of Justice, European Court of Justice here. It's actually an Italian case where this is a paper written by Asciari 2016, but actually evaluated a decision by the Court of Justice of the European Union. In this case, actually a hospital awarded the ambulance service, the service for ambulance, to a voluntary organization through direct contracting. So of course, there is an issue insofar as competition is concerned. First, you have to open the competition to the market, and you can just directly award a contract. There is a rule on that. But at any rate, in this particular case, although the court was very clear in asking the legislation to provide a specific initiative and guidelines to make sure that the rules are very clear. But here, the court actually uphold the decision to award the contract to a voluntary organization simply because they say it is not really what do you call it? It is not really a government contracting initiative, because here what is happening is that the voluntary organization is called by the hospital when there is a need, and then this voluntary organization was just requesting reimbursement of the gasoline used for the ambulance. So in that case, it was saying that since this is not really based on a profit organization, so it's not really a market-based organization, but a voluntary organization that is called by the government, by the hospital in case of emergency. So the court actually said that it does not really violate the competition issue insofar as public procurement is concerned. Although, of course, again, when do we say that this is actually not a market player? When? So the line between a voluntary organization and a market player has to be cleared. So that was the court decision, and it was highlighted in that particular paper. But at any rate, there are so many papers actually that would be listed in the literature that we will be releasing this fall, which actually raise the issue on the potential conflict of sustainability, which is actually called secondary principles, and the key principles of public procurement and transparency, integrity, competition, and treatment. Actually, we are also arguing the why called sustainability as a secondary principle. Why not as a principle? It's like you have primary principle and secondary principle. Some of us actually who are on this field are working on research that is very focused on the role of sustainable public procurement as an integrity mechanism to prevent fraud and corruption. So I know somebody who is actually working on that, which is, I think, I do agree. I mean, in my practice, before actually pursuing my graduate study, I was a government contracting lawyer for 6 years. And then I tried to prevent corruption in all of the that I had. That is one of the things that I was, and I am still very proud when I was chairman of the Bids and Awards Committee in numerous projects in the Philippines. My projects were not in any way involved in any corrupt practices, to the point that I actually left my post because of numerous death threats. So I left my post because I had numerous death threats in trying to prevent corruption in the biddings that I was handling. So at any rate, but why sustainability can actually prevent that? First, you have to make sure that your suppliers are responsible. So that will, in a way, prevent um, fly-by-night suppliers to actually um, propose or submit a tender. In my experience, I have seen so many suppliers that were very focused on a certain, the projects were very focused on certain politicians, meaning that if that is the politician in this particular LGU, you'll know that these particular suppliers were always the suppliers of that particular regime. And then when the regime changes, you realize that the suppliers also change. So you might be thinking, are they really real market players? Or I don't know, because if you are real a market player, you will be a bidder irrespective who is in the position. So at any rate, that's why I'm saying that sustainability can actually hinder or promote more integrity in public procurement. But these are the papers that actually discussed that there is really a conflict between sustainability and public procurement. So these are the citations. So I'm gonna give this PowerPoint anyway. So if you want to look at the papers, so these are the citations. But for us to really understand about this conflict and why is it an emerging topic, is let us first understand what really is sustainable public procurement. So I first introduced the issue before actually discussing what sustainable public procurement is. As UNEP actually used this particular definition of what sustainable public procurement. So of course, it's a process whereby organizations, by organizations we mean of course government organization, instrumentalities or entities, actually even private sectors may be covered by public procurement if, for example, the funds that you will be using, you are a recipient of a grant. And then, of course, that grant is a public fund. So if you are going to disburse the funds received by the government, even if you are a private sector, you have to make sure that you follow certain rules. And then, of course, that is by this process, the government meet their needs for goods, services, and works, including utilities, in a way that that is achieving value for money on a whole life basis in terms of generating benefits not only to the organization but also to the society and economy while minimizing the damage to the environment. So basically, there are actually three pillars of sustainable development. We're very familiar of that: economic, social, and environment. And then SPP seeks to make sure that there is an appropriate balance of these three pillars. So in economic factors, you have to make sure that the cost will not be on the price alone of the product, because you have to make sure that the entire life cycle, say for example, if you buy lighting equipment or bulbs, of course you will make sure that it's an LED. Of course, it's higher than the ordinary bulbs, but of course, if you compute the cost of the life cycle cost, it is actually cheaper. Or now, right now, there is actually a call for looking at the circularity in terms of the economic benefits, meaning that as much as possible, you have to make sure that you are also reducing the waste. and not just, you don't just compute on the life cycle in a sense that you are very focused on maintenance and operation. Now you have to also consider the cost of disposal, so that to make sure that the real cost of the product is actually economical. And then of course, social factors, we all know that employment condition, human rights. About 2 years ago, I was asked to evaluate a project in our country. And then one thing, because of the issue of human trafficking, so it's actually some issues that contractors were actually bringing illegal migrants to complete a particular project. Of course, that's very, very hard to actually um, prove, but that can be prevented if you're doing social procurement. In what way? You have to make sure that the suppliers are actually implementing social conditions in terms of the delivery of the project. More so, you're also gonna evaluate the performance of the contractors in their previous projects. So in that case, if you are doing sustainable public procurement, you are preventing issues on the possible commission of human trafficking in terms of uh, human trafficking in government contracts. And then of course, the other one is an environmental factor. Like for example, climate change. That is the next paper that I will be presenting, the one that I wrote in 2019. So basically, we can actually use public procurement as a mechanism to reduce carbon emission by making sure that the solution that will be provided by a supplier or contractor is actually a solution that will address the issue on climate change. Now, as an example of a paper that actually tried to address the issue that there is really no conflict between sustainability and the other procurement principles is the one that I wrote in 2019, Sustainable Public Procurement in the Green Climate Fund. For you to be able to actually give an example, you have to show a particular procuring entity. So in this case, I evaluated the administrative guidelines for corporate procurement of the Green Climate Fund. And because Green Climate Fund has two procurement regulations, corporate procurement pertains to the procurement of the organization of its needs in its actual operation. And of course, Green Climate Fund also have regulations of public procurement with respect to projects. But here, I focus my assessment on how the Green Climate Fund as an institution is actually buying. But in doing so, I try to evaluate first all the negotiation documents started from all of the published at the UNFCCC. Tell me about it. I read all of it because this was my LLM thesis, so that I will check, was there ever a time that public procurement was introduced in the discussion in the climate change negotiation? And it was actually only in 1992 during the Earth Summit where procurement was identified as a legitimate activity, and it becomes one of the priority actions in the Agenda 21. And then, of course, followed by all of these other documents until the Paris Agreement. Months before that, there is already 6 principles for SPP. Now, the Sustainable Development Agenda is very clear, specifically in Target 12.7.1, where sustainable public procurement should be promoted. So in this case, we will see that actually public procurement has been identified as a possible mechanism to combat climate change. And then of course, this paper also highlighted some of the best examples. Specifically here in Europe, Europe has so many examples on how public procurement has been used as an instrument to contribute to the reduction of carbon emission. They called it as low carbon procurement. One of the projects is the GP 2020. So here I highlighted some of the examples that are actually presented in the GP 2020, a project in Europe that is actually maintaining low carbon procurement. And then after that, I told you I evaluated and I see the loopholes in the administrative guidance for corporate procurement. And then I called that, you know, when you look at the funds, supposed to be it's climate finance funds, so how are you buying? So I was actually asking and arguing that the Green Climate Fund should be the prime mover in the adoption of low carbon procurement, and it should be a default procurement mechanism, and it will never be and should not be in conflict with other procurement principles, because that is the very purpose why the Green Climate Fund was created, to combat climate change. So in all of its activities, no matter how trivial it is, even in buying coupon bonds or typewritings, you have to make sure that you're buying recyclable materials, or you have to compute the possible carbon emission in all of the materials or supplies that you are buying. So in this particular paper, I am arguing that sustainability should not be a conflict. Specifically, if you look at the very principle why the organization is existing, or if you look at the very principle why the funds were appropriated. So here, of course, I am running out of time. Sustainable public procurement, a brief literature review. I'm not going to discuss the whole review because we're still working on it. I don't want to preempt the publication of this review this coming fall. So at any rate, we conducted a literature review from April to May, and the coverage is from years 2016 to 2020. These are all the key phrases that we use, and we look for all popular databases. What is the difference between this literature review with the rest of the literature review that are available right now? Is because most of the literature reviews sometimes are divided into two areas of public procurement. One is on the operation side and the other is on the legal. So in this particular review, we both look at those search engines. So this is not just limited on legal perspective. We actually go to search engine on businesses, search engine of government, public administration, to make sure that we will be able to see all the published articles that are discussing sustainable public procurement from all areas. And initially, we have 411 articles, but using our questionnaires, we were only, we resulted to 208. So basically, these are the trend. If you see in 2018, there were very limited publication, and then in 2020, there was very limited publication. Because in 2017, I think that there was a very high call for sustainable public procurement after the adoption of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, because it's now like 2016, 15 very limited materials, and I'm saying, okay, public procurement has been identified, yet why is there not very much activities in terms of research? And then in terms of future researches, what we have seen actually insofar as those articles that were included in our literature review. So these are the potential topics, more particularly now on preferential treatment, and of course the need for more capacity building and the life cycle costing, because these are some of the barriers actually that prevent government agencies to adopt sustainable public procurement. So if those are some of the barriers, those are actually the emerging topics insofar as sustainable public procurement is concerned. Now, in terms of a policy instrument, I'm also working for OECD as a consultant, and we're working on a research work on the assessment of a public procurement and sustainable development agenda. Our specific question is it really a standalone policy or just an instrument to support other policies? Of course, very clear, 12.7.1 calls for procurement that should be sustainable. But the question is SPP a target or can it be a driver for the achievements of the other SDG goals? Now, to give you a specific example of this particular issue, I work for UNEP for 18 days to evaluate the progress of sustainable public procurement in Moldova. So in this case, I go over the practices and regulations of Moldova in terms of public procurement. Why? Because in 2017, Moldova adopted its action plan. So I evaluated the implementation of the action plan using this particular framework. Because if you are also in public procurement, you know that OECD had published a methodology for assessment of public procurement and sustainable public procurement only in 2020. So using the maps as a framework, I actually evaluated the implementation. And this is the assessment. Of course, some of the findings, I didn't put all of the findings, just the key findings. Though there are actually legal framework, the problem is implementation, because there is no specific degree. So that is why the call is actually to adopt a secondary legislation. So I assisted the national legal expert in the drafting of the proposed secondary legislation for sustainable public procurement. And this particular legislation ensures that there would be mandatory SPP criteria, there would be methodologies on how to use life cycle costing, there should be sustainability clauses in the standard conditions, and then what is the role of the public procurement agency, making sure that the procuring working group or the Basin Award Committee in the case of the Philippines should have should be the prime mover of SPP, and there should be strict monitoring and surveillance reporting. And then of course here, the strategy that we adopt, I want to emphasize this, because if you look at the strength of Moldova, it's actually based on small, medium enterprises. It's about, that's the backbone of the economy. So in that case, the best way to actually promote more sustainability is to leverage on maximizing opportunities for SMEs. So as mentioned, preferential treatment for SMEs is actually a target, not in sustainable consumption goal in goal 12, but in goal 8, target 8.3. So in that case, you can see sustainable public procurement can be a driver or an instrument to achieve target 8.3 on the promotion of SMEs. So what is the trend now? We have 12 or 17 goals and 167 targets. Imagine if you're going to evaluate the potential link of sustainable public procurement in the accomplishment of these targets, then we will see that the sustainable public procurement is not just a standalone policy, but actually a driver to achieve all the other sustainable development agenda. So if you have questions, I don't know if I was able to discuss the things that I want to say.
Okay, thank you, Jelly. What a very rich and dense discussion. So I'm sure that for many of us, it's an eye opener. Like we learned about procurement in the first place, and we actually have people from the audience from DBM and Public-Private Partnership of the Philippines. So I think that this is also going to be very interesting to them. Are there any questions from the audience? Okay, maybe I'll take the chair's prerogative to ask. I understand as part of your research, you were able to speak with some representatives from multilateral development banks. Maybe you could share with us the level of awareness of sustainability in the MDBs, and how open are they to incorporating sustainability in existing procurement policies?
all MDBs have already revised their procurement regulations as early as 2016. It was actually a very good move from multilateral development banks. So at least in that particular case, I would say that the regulations, the framework is already available. The only concern again is that, of course, we know that MDBs, as much as possible, do not actually interfere with country perspective. So that is why they are giving it as an option, as a voluntary option. But in terms of acceptability, it was very interesting, because it actually depends on the region. I was talking to a senior official in the Inter-American Development Bank, and I was very impressed the way IADB is actually implementing sustainable public procurement. I mean, based on my interviews with representatives of 7 banks, the most advanced in terms of adopting sustainable public procurement is the Inter-American Development Bank. They have so many pilot projects. And then when I asked what could be the reason, actually it is because most of the initiatives come from the network. So it's like the private sectors, the civil societies are very active, and there is a peer pressure to the government to adopt sustainable public procurement. In that case, it's very easy for Inter-American Development Bank to provide funds without having to actually, uh, change the mindset of the people, because these are the people asking support from the banks to make sure that there will be more pilot projects, there will be more capacity building to make sure that the personnel of various government organizations are incorporating more sustainability. And when you look at areas like Africa and the Middle East, actually you will see that the banks are very focused on social issues. So it's like most of the pilot projects that they're trying to incorporate is protection of women. So if you have a project that will incorporate gender diversity, you will get more preference in terms of funding. So it actually depends on a particular region. In Europe, it's very focused on environment. So EBRD is actually mainstreaming or very focused on the green public procurement, because that is the trend here in Europe. So in that case, I would say that insofar as my project is concerned, first, the rules and the frameworks are available. So that is good. But there is a need for country assessment, because first, the country, as the executing agency, implementing agencies need more capacity building. And then, of course, there is actually a need to promote more sustainability in the market, because some of the issues is actually lack of green products. So those are some of the challenges insofar as the role of multilateral development banks in promoting sustainable public procurement. But I was actually happy to know that some of them have funds for technical assistance in terms of the review of policy and regulations of the countries who opt to incorporate sustainability in their public procurement regulations.
Thank you, Jelly. Reden, are you going to ask a question?
Yeah, I had a question. Thanks, Nina. And thanks, Jelly, for your interesting presentation. I think in the first half of your talk, you were talking about the key ideas from the literature. And I noticed that most of the ideas are from Western authors. And to me, it's not surprising, because the procurement system itself and the institutions that guide it are rooted in Western realities and institutional context. But I was just wondering whether there are some emerging ideas that are informed by global South realities or by the experiences of countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, that have been also struggling to fight corruption. And procurement, of course, is one of the best tools through which we could combat corruption and some entrenched political culture in our countries or in our context. Thank you.
That's actually a good question. And for the last 4 years after I left the Philippines, that is what I have been doing in terms of the international discussions on public procurement, represent developing countries. Actually, I think my voice was heard. I am working in one of the projects of a book to be published by Routledge on highlighting the practices of different countries in terms of combating corruption. So I'm working with University of Stellenbosch in South Africa and the GW Law School for this particular project. So there is a chapter on the Philippines, which I am currently working on. Hopefully by next year it will be released. But at any rate, as one of the problems that I have noticed insofar as sustainable public procurement is concerned is that if you look at developing countries like the Philippines, our law is primarily based on low price criterion. So of course, in my assessment, why is that so? Because I think the government or the lawmakers decided to put it that way to minimize the discretion of procuring entities. If you are in the practice of public procurement in our country, it's like a check and cross thing. Is it present? Is it there? The procuring, the Bids and Award Committee didn't have that much discretion. When I was part of the Bids and Award Committee, I had so many cases filed against me. Why? Because I was trying to award a project based on best value. And best value is not an option in our procurement regulations. But of course, I was trying to argue, I remember one case where I argued on the use of academic freedom to actually support the award of a project on the procurement of, microscope. Because of course, when we receive the project, sometimes as technical specifications, specifically if it's a national funded project, the technical specifications were there. And then when I asked our nursing department, do you need this microscope? Because we receive funds from the national government. It was years ago. And it said, no, because those are microscope for high school. We're College of Nursing. We need this high-tech. So, we changed the technical specifications. I fought some people, of course, and trying to change that. Why? Because we have to make sure that we are addressing the need of the end user. The end user is our student. Why are we going to give our College of Nursing students a microscope that is micro something? I don't know technical, but nursing students should be getting a high-tech microscope. So in that case, we changed the technical specification. We used our academic freedom to make sure that, and our autonomy, that we will be procuring different microscope from the funds given by the national government. So in that case, you see, if we look on sustainability, although I must commend our government, the GPPB, because they have actually initiated some policies on the promotion of sustainable public procurement, and even the national government, because I am writing the country fact sheet for the Philippines that will be included in the global review. So one thing is that there is a pilot project in terms of the procurement of supplies that will be bought from the DBM, and some of them are actually incorporating already sustainable criteria on green supplies. So although it's a pilot thing, but I think that is already, and I will be writing on it, because the government received funds from a European organization for that pilot project. So you see, developing countries are adapting sustainability in procurement through pilot projects because it's very difficult to change the law. I was reviewing Cambodia, and then Cambodia was actually pleading, please help us to change our laws, because if the laws are the regulation, there's no legal and policy framework for them to incorporate sustainability in government contracting, public procurement. They can do it because we all know that you may be subjected to litigation if you are not following the procurement regulation and processes. And if there is no single word or phrase in the framework that promotes sustainability, they will be very difficult to implement.
Thank you for sharing that, Jelly. I think that it really highlights the need for developing countries to really bring to the fore experiences in procurement, especially anti-corruption and sustainability issues. Pam has a question. I think we are going. For those of you who have to leave, we understand if you have to leave, but I think, Jelly, if it's okay, we can borrow a little more of your time just for us to push through with the questions. So, Pam.
Hi, thanks Nina, and thanks Jelly for your really interesting talk. My question is, there are very stringent standards for for sustainability reporting. And I remember seeing a map of, the different color-coded map of the different countries that are that are doing this based on the percentage of registered companies who are doing GRI. And of course, the Philippines has one of the lightest colors in the map, because it's not really sustainability as a whole, not just in procurement, is not really adopted by the majority yet of the companies in the Philippines. So my question is, if you integrate sustainability in our procurement process, does this put Filipino companies at a disadvantage? Because it's likely that the vendors with sustainability criteria will likely come from the West. And secondarily, and maybe this is more of a comment rather than a question, it seems like if we want to embrace sustainability in the procurement process, then we need an equivalent policy framework that strengthens, that encourages companies and gives incentives to local companies to also embrace sustainability. Otherwise, it doesn't look like it's going to be a fair ball game.
I understand. That's why before discussing what sustainable public procurement is, my first assessment is actually on the potential conflict of sustainability with the other key principles. Say, for example, as you have mentioned, it could be on unfair to local players who are not at par with foreign players in terms of sustainability requirements or compliance. But if last year I published also a paper on public procurement and corporate social responsibility, arguing that the government should be the first institution that should be compliant with corporate social responsibility in terms of promoting CSR in the entire supply chain or value chain. Yes, while I agree with you that it may put our private sectors in disadvantage position if you're going to compare it with foreign players, but there are so many strategies by which you can actually level the playing fields. One is, of course, government contracting can be used through public procurement for innovation. In that case, government can actually support certain businesses and enterprises for the development of more sustainable products. For example, more efficient, energy efficient supplies that the government need, but through what we called as public procurement for innovation. So in that case, part of the government funds will be in terms of grant for capacity building, so that this organization or private sectors will be able to adopt some of the best practices in terms of incorporating more sustainability or compliance with green requirements on their products. So there are ways by which the government can do it. But of course, in my assessment, that should be the way forward. Or that's why I told you that the emerging trend in terms of research is preferential treatment, because we know that when we actually incorporate sustainability, you are correct, foreign suppliers are way far better than local suppliers. So that is why the call now is for more preferential treatment without, of course, compromising the requirement for local players to actually incorporate more green products if the issue is on green products, or to comply with requirements for green buildings, green infrastructures, if the requirement is for infrastructure projects. So that is there are ways by which the government can actually balance the potential negative effect to local players. And that is actually internationally acceptable to the point that it may not be an issue in terms of trade negotiations.
Thank you, Jelly. There was another question, I think, from Paula.
Hi, Nia. Thank you. Actually, I just wanted to ask about if you're familiar with the Philippine Green Public Procurement Framework, and you already mentioned that earlier. So I'm happy to know that you'll be part of those who will assess the Philippines' readiness and status of the GPP. But I wanted to share as well with respect to what Pam asked, that the DTI is currently actually working on the domestic preference. It was brought about actually by the current pandemic that we wanted to give our local suppliers and manufacturers that preference. And it's actually allowed under our current procurement law that we provide that domestic preference. But it has been hard for them to actually provide some of our local suppliers that domestic preference, because some of their products are actually from abroad. So for us, for DTI to be able to give that domestic preference, it has to be also from local products, locally manufactured products. So that's one. And then secondly, on what you noted as to the per low cost, where the Philippine public procurement is more on low cost. But actually, if you recall, we actually promote lowest calculated and responsive bid. So actually, I don't see anything wrong with what you did in revising the technical specs, because actually that's where we need to capacitate more the agencies and the LGUs on how to properly quantify and put the qualifications, technical specs, so that they don't just copy. But for example, they want the brand, laptop brand, for example, they want Microsoft. They just copy the technical specs without actually reviewing what they actually need. So that's where actually the GPPB is helping the agencies and LGUs on how to properly do their technical specs, so that they don't get low quality, that what they see as low quality but actually meets their technical specifications noted in their bidding documents. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, Paula. Actually, the case that I was mentioning, it was more than 10 years ago. I think it was in 2005, 2006. So imagine in that scenario when I don't even know what best value is. I just want to make sure that what my dean needs will be supplied. And imagine we don't have that much leeway to decide. So we had to like argued with higher officials. So that's what I'm trying to say. So it was sometimes in 2005, 2006, not right now. So yes, I'm not actually involved. I wanted to be involved more in our promotion of sustainable public procurement in the Philippines, specifically in green public procurement. I worked with DTI in 2012-13 in our region on more on also on SMEs. But since I left the country, I have not been in touch with the Philippine government. So if you may need even in any technical assistance, even in pro bono, I am willing to help DTI in doing so. I work with African Development Bank in the drafting of its guidelines for sustainable public procurement for free. So I can do it also for my country. So if you need technical assistance for capacity building, I'm just an email away. I will be very happy to. I actually talked to Regional Director Toledo because I came from Batangas. I asked him like, do you want some free lectures? I was telling her anything you need because for, Regional Toledo was a friend when I was still working with Batangas State University. So yes, I'm not particularly involved. My involvement in terms of assessment is as a consultant for UNEP for the preparation of the country fact sheet on the 2021 SPP Global Review.
Okay, thank you. What a generous offer from Jelly. We have here in the audience some members of the government, so they might take you up on that offer. You can email me to ask me for Jelly's email. I'll forward it to you. Okay, so I don't want to take any more of the time of Jelly, our speaker, and of course of our audience. So thank you very much to everyone who participated this evening. It was really another great session to share our learnings. I think we all learned a great deal about procurement and sustainability procurement as an emerging policy and research agenda. Okay, thank you, Jelly. And good evening, everyone. Good day to you who are in the more Western Hemisphere. Okay, bye.
Bye, ciao.
Ciao.